cast for you, I held my breath.
Welcome to the PINU Poetry Show with your host, Carmelo Militano. Hi, Darren. Can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Carmelo.
Perfect. So Darren's in Montreal, and here we are in Winnipeg, and we actually successfully made this connection. We're all in the studio. And thank you, Emily, for helping out. See you later. Cheers. So welcome, Darren. Now, Darren, you're... I'm going to read your bio before we actually start talking about your work.
Sure.
Darren Bifford is the author of Wedding in Fire Country, Nightwood Editions 212, Fall Spring, Brick Books 218, as well as the chapbooks Wolf Hunt, Cactus Press 2010, Hermit Crab, Baseline Press 214, and The Age of Revolution, which I actually read, and Strother Press. Did I pronounce that correctly?
I think so.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to pronounce it myself.
Yeah.
It's a lake in Ontario somewhere. So I'd ask Jim Johnstone, who is the publisher there, what's going on with that name. Yeah.
He's such a scoundrel, that Jim Johnstone. A suburban boy with a lake press.
That's right.
And Strother Press 2017, and Darren lives in Montreal, although I think you're originally from out west, aren't you?
I am. I'm from the Okanagan.
Yeah, nice. My brother's he lives in Calgary. He's got a place out in the Okanagan. Well, let's begin by talking about this collection, and I guess
sure.
the first thing I that came to mind as I was going through it, and I'm curious if you've made this distinction. How is this full collection? And this is more for our audience, because I think I know the answer, but I think it'd be interesting for our audience. How is this full collection different, say, from your chapbook in your mind?
Well, there's more poems in it. That is the most obvious answer that I can say with it.
But the process must have been different, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I don't mean that to be my only answer, but there's actually a certain seriousness around that, because I will either write an individual poem or short bursts of poems that are well suited for a chapbook size.
Yeah.
So in the end, I think I even kept the rough order, adding a few poems here and there of two of my previous chapbooks, The Age of Revolution and Hermit Crab, in there, as well as the poems that were written in the meantime, which weren't collected anywhere. But I don't have the view or the inclination, I guess, more so, to conceive of a book-length project, at least not at this stage. So the notion of writing something like one would have to do, in all likelihood, with an MFA thesis. That's never been the way I approached writing poems. So I just sort of stuck them all together once they got to be enough of them.
I guess that's sort of where I was kind of moving towards, because I've put out a chapbook too, and my experience has been the chapbook came out, and then I thought, well, if I write some more, I have a book, basically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, with The Age of Revolution, short chapbook, which are the more or less the most recent poems in the book, the first section, I only got started on that because Jan Zwicky had written me and told me that this press out west, Green Boathouse Press, they do really, really, really fine chapbooks, the kind that cost hundreds of dollars to buy, were looking for a new collection, and they were looking for something with sort of torqued, compressed, intellectually dense kind of poems. And I just took that as, I'll try to write those kinds of poems for it. And as you can see, I did not get published in that press. I don't think they put out anybody in the end, but I ended up writing those just simply because of the requirement of that sort of style, that sort of form, rather than an idea of I've got something to say.
Right. Well, I before we go on, in case you've just tuned in, you're listening to the PINU Poetry Show with your host, Carmelo Militano. You're at CKUW FM, Winnipeg at 95.9, and my special guest is the poet Darren Bifford, who currently lives in Montreal. I was going to say currently. You probably have lived there longer than just currently.
I have.
Well, let's sort of jump into it a little bit. I'm going to make some remarks about your poetry, and of course, I can be wrong. So I have no problem with being corrected. And it seems to me, just being jocular about it, there's a lot of snark in this book, if I can say that. And part of it seems to me, if we're going to intellectualize it, is that you're looking at some scourges of both the 20th and 21st century, and I think, and some of the scourges that I think that you've identified are, I made a quick note here, the three scourges. If we ask ourselves, what are the three evils of the 21st century? And I think Darren's answer is ideology, propaganda, and totalitarianism. Does that ring true with you?
Those definitely seem like three evils. Yeah. So.
I'm just wondering, but you're sort of taking shots at all of those under different forms, I think, aren't you?
Well, it's what precipitated a lot of the writing of this book was reading quite intensely, as far as I could, and a good deal of 20th century stuff, 20th century history, and more of a visceral sense of the activity of what some writers talk about, to use a capital letter, history with a capital H, the fact that we are affected by what's happened, and that's continuing to affect our lives in a really kind of almost physical, but definitely more of a spiritual sense.
Well, I think
that's just what's on my mind, I suppose. As far as the poems go, the snark, or the irony, the shifts in tone, I'm interested in the use of rhetoric in poems. And when I try to step back and look at my poems and figure out what's going on in them, I see that there's a good deal of use of rhetoric with tonal shifts, and I think that's maybe what you're hearing there.
I'm hearing also the sardonic, and I'm hearing it seems to me that you're first of all, let's backing up underneath your poetry, let's just say, your poems are really kind of a personal response to reading, aren't they? What you said earlier. A large part of them. They're not like there are some poems of clearly are personally based, but a lot of them seem to be as you were alluding to, a reading of history. Yeah, it's there. I mean, my own sense of how poetry gets made is in relationship to the rest of the language. So, I mean, for example, Birthday Letter clearly isn't like that.
Yes.
Well, that stands out. That stands out in almost in the tradition of the personal lyric. And I'm contrasting that to other poems that you have, where again I'm kind of, and we've already kind of played with this, and it seems to me you're looking at the intersection of the self, society, and history, and how and that seems to produce your work. Does that bring? That sounds
accurate to me, and I actually don't, from my own sense of what poetry is, it's poems that I'm interested in reading, and then there's these guys like Czesław Miłosz.
Yeah, I like him.
For me, Auden is W.H. Auden, really really important figure for me as well, and I mean just taking those two guys as examples. I mean, they're both quite attuned or concerned with the culture at large, including philosophy and history and religion. And what else is poetry going to do except to take a personal or individual response to it? I think there's a distinction to be made between the individual and the personal here. The personal, yes, sir, Birthday Letter is, I'm embarrassed to read it for the most part because it's far too confessional for my taste. So the Terza Rima form rescues that somewhat. But I forgot where I was going with that. But
well, I mean, to help you out, I mean, what I wrote down here is that your poems emerge out of your understanding of both the nature and consequence of myth, ideas, paintings, and politics, the society at large. That's kind of
And I think to deal with that, I was going to make that distinction between the individual and the personal, because the lyric poem is an individual voice, right? That's what the lyric poem is, and it stands or falls with that. So it need not be confessional. It need not be about one's life as a biographical fact, but the voice as a single voice in a single lyric, whether that's a sonnet or something a little bit longer. Not many of my poems jump over a single page. They feel somewhat more like, almost like dramatic monologues, where there's a single voice speaking from a place and to a person, and sometimes it's not quite sure, who the person or who the audience is, but it's that very individual, like an individual, a soul. It's a response to these sorts of collective circumstances that we found ourselves in.
Right.
Well,
again, to draw attention to some of the paintings you referenced, for example, Goya, and I think the terrible paintings, not terrible as in bad, but terrible in the events that he was recording.
Sure.
When the French
shooting of the 3rd of May.
Yeah, I think the French are just mercilessly gunning down.
Yeah.
All these
it's a great painting. I think it's a very good one that reflects just what we were saying about this confronting of an individual person against these historical forces, because in it, 2 men are being shot, being executed by some soldiers. And I just actually happen to have that painting on my wall for the most part, as well as another painting where there's a bull being of a bullfight. And they weren't up there for any special reason, but when attempting to write poems, simply just was looking at them and came into the books. Yeah.
And part of that too, I think, your social commentary. It's very quite diverse, but it seems to me one of the important things coming out in your poems is the notion of an ideology or a perspective. In other words, the idea of the unlimited ends up creating the jackhammer of boots, to quote you.
The idea of the unlimited.
The idea of unlimited, that there are no limits. That there are no limits ends up creating. I think you used the phrase the jackhammer of boots.
Right. In other words, of black boots. Like soldiers marching.
Yeah, like an ism, whatever, that doesn't have perspective. It's all about is, in a sense, you're almost to paraphrase Naipaul, you're in the land of the believers, and believers believe there's no end to the revolution, right? And it's always on the horizon. You're always, and that ends up creating, as you accurately point out, the jackhammer of boots. Does that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, power and the will to power, nihilism, and and pain as a consequence. But that is a response to the breaking of limits is a curious thought that I haven't actually thought it in those terms itself. But I think lurking behind a good deal of these poems is a certain sort of moral impulse. The poems themselves are not nihilistic. The poems themselves don't believe that they're not addressing the world as if there are no moral limits, as if justice doesn't exist.
No, absolutely. In fact, in fact, what I wrote down here is that you're really, maybe on another layer, you're almost addressing the issue of what is the nature and consequence of evil. War. Sure.
Sure. I think the theological issue of evil is really the most pressing thing, and indeed, that's one you can't help but emerge out of thinking about atrocity in the 20th century and history in general without being just obliterated by it.
And I think that's where the snark comes from, if I could say so. And I'm not trying to be flip about it, but I'm just sort of saying that really the seriousness of your poems really are trying to address, both directly and indirectly, that question, the consequence of evil, and the evil ends up being things like the notion that there are no limits. That creates evil, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. When one acts as if there are no consequences when one.
Yeah, and one believes that.
Go on.
Oh, I'm sorry, I cut you off. No, I'd rather you go on. I think the show's about you, Darren, not about me.
Well, that's good. I know. I'm very happy for your comments. I mean, about the book.
Well, I think I felt it's interesting that you brought up Miloš, because I also, in my own notes, wrote down that some of this work reminds me of Jaruzelski, but perhaps in also the Polish poet, but also in a less evocative way. I think you, I think Miloš is more probably, you're closer to him than Jaruzelski's got that whole, in fact, he calls one of his books, he uses the word mystic in it, and there is that kind of a very
Mysticism for Beginners is that book.
Yeah, I love that book, and he's very much an intuitive kind of guy, and he sees. He writes about things as they are, but by doing that, he gives you a feeling that there's more there, right? Whereas Miloš is very direct in his social commentary. I mean, I was it's funny you should bring him up, because I was just reading him the other day about how he, and I connected this with you actually. He talks about how the lyric poet has a cold heart, and that's and he says that's the medical condition of being a lyric poet. And I think, anyway, what I mean by that is that I think, and where I connected this with you is in the sense not so much that you're a lyric poet, but that, or do you have a cold heart, but that you like to dissect and look carefully at some of the issues that are quite current, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the question of influence and having all these other poets brought up as we're talking about my book, I feel it's right, and with any other poet as well, any other writer, I'm almost equally, if not more, interested in the other writers or non-writers, music or whatever that's part of their orbit. That's kind of where they're finding their own heritage, finding their bearings, and I've given that. Tried to make myself aware of the kinds of writers that I'm attracted to, and it has happened that they're not so much Canadian or American, for that matter, but
I totally
Eastern
get
European poetry in translation, of course, since I can't speak any of these languages. I do have a good friend who's Polish who helps out to some regard, but it's especially for someone like Miloš, when for people who know him, this will be a self-evident thing to say, but this guy is, and his friends and the people of that generation, not just him, are putting a stake in, or a claim on, I should say, the whole Western humanistic literary heritage, the whole thing, from the Bible over, and saying that there's something vital here. And they're doing it in the face of fascism and communism. They're doing it in the face of ideologies that would have that entire conversation, say, that entire tradition demolished. And especially in the mid-40s, when in Warsaw, he's doing this. It's incredibly. It doesn't seem like he's on the winning side, but he's invoking guys like jackhammer, the kind of a Catholic social thinker who's also trying to deal with this stuff at the same time, and I'm inspired by that, and because it's not as if we're dealing with fascism or the same sorts of immediate atrocities, at least in our own lives here in Canada, but it's there's a certain kind of heroism to it, and it's not postmodern. Is the other thing to say, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think,
and I'm not a postmodern guy. So.
No, far from it. And I think part of what you're talking about is Miloš was, it seems to me, was very interested in help of showing the truth. And because the truth is often concealed, especially under totalitarian regimes, and I think, but at the same time, what's interesting about Miloš, and I see this in your own work, you're also, in a sense, if I can use this phrase, a skeptical romantic.
Yeah, Don Mackay who was my editor for this book, characterized the work as being a skeptical lyricism, I think is how I put it.
I mean, you're in favor of things, but at the same time, you're also almost undermining the very things you're putting forward at the same. I'm not sure if I'm expressing that correctly.
Yeah, I mean, if people for reading some of the work, and I don't know if some of the poems I'll read later, we'll get at that. But another of my core convictions, I guess, comes from people like Jan Zawicki here in Canada, who had been a teacher of mine, and some of the people connected to her, is that poetry thinks. It's a way of knowing the world. It's after its own sort of truth, and within as a modern, skepticism is part of that, right? There's several different sorts of voices and different sorts of impulses colliding through our brains all at the same time: faith and doubt, and asserting things, and taking those assertions away. And that's just part of the dynamic of what it is to think in our situation.
Right.
So,
well, I think this is a fine time for you to read one of your poems. And in case, folks, you just tuned in, you're listening to the PI New Poetry Show with your host, Carmelo Militano. And I have the poet Darren Bifford reading from False Spring. So I hope you have a poem there handy to read.
I do. I'll just read the very first poem in the book, which is not terribly representative formally, but I like it.
Okay.
It's called Letter of Intent.
Okay.
So, Letter of Intent. Somehow, the end comes nearer when you're not looking. To dissolve all problems would mean a clearer way of living into the future. I, for one, desire those very bright and well-positioned days bequeathed to baby boomers. When you're not looking is when it's commonly said the end comes nearer. Uncommonly, it's said exactly when you're looking it arrives, which is a real issue. However well everything seems to be going, you attend also to the darkening sky. The Pixies' Stormy Weather is an end-of-the-party sing-along track for my generation. In my own life and in the lives of my friends is the way I begin my sentences. The end comes knocking, as in the joke. Unlike the joke, it doesn't knock. Does the weather mirror the soul, or vice versa? By vice versa, I mean the pub in Montreal. I can't breathe when the sky turns black, which suggests the priority of the weather. Physiological changes precede the insights that might result in new therapies or pills. I'm off topic, however else you might put the essential matter. The spirit of the thing, I mean. I wish it were the great age of rereading, but that is simply how it is for me. May I take a number, you a prescription? Tell me something. My hopes are very great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I that ending is a real. Well, the ending is really what, after all that, kind of knocks you out of your chair almost. You don't expect that. It's sort of a ironic kick at yourself almost.
Yeah.
Well, moving right along as we're talking about this stuff, the other thing that about your poetry, and the other note that I wrote down here is that another sort of underlying question seems to be on what is the ground that we're going to really pin our existence on. I mean, I think we're in a situation where people are, and poetry seems to express this. The notion is, so what in what way will we create? What will be the scaffolding on which we create our existence? And I think that's part of what your poetry seems to be pushing in that direction as well. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know.
It's a big question and a big statement. I realize that.
I think what in these poems is lurking in the corners is one point in that elements of cohesion must be weakened, which is a poem that riffs around that painting we spoke of earlier, the Goya's painting, shooting of 3rd of May, or is it June? I forgot the name of the painting. Anyhow, but at the end of the poem, it says, perhaps Christ is about. And as I was reading these poems with Amanda Jernigan, who wrote the afterword for the book, and Hamilton launching it there, her recent books deal quite a bit with traditional Christian narrative and theology, and just so she did a great book.
I think
is,
I had her on the show. I think it's a little like, it's almost like a book of Psalms, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, it's like liturgy itself. I'd written an essay about it for my blog, but I was, for whatever reason, I suddenly realized that a good deal of these poems is inclined towards at least a certain amount of address towards the Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we find meaning in a world where that might just obliterate us? One can be a traditionalist about these things, and whether I am or not doesn't really matter. But I see in the poems there's at least the kind of gesture towards that, and
I also think
our relationships. So
I also think there's a gesture towards suggesting there was a past Eden before the current mess, and I'm not sure.
Oh,
no, I'm not sure.
Really?
There's an answer to that, but it seems there is an underlying suggestion that there was a time when things weren't as messed up as they are right now.
Yeah, but I would hope that the poems don't assert something that conservative.
No, they don't.
Because I think in that poem I just read, there was a time when things weren't so screwed up in the kind of golden age from about 1945 to the 70s in the Western world.
Right.
The baby boomer time. That seems like would have been a great time to have stuff and not worry.
That's true.
about things in the same way that we do.
But no, before we go on too much, we're having so much fun. We've only got about 3 minutes left. I'm hoping. I hope I'm not. First of all, I'm hoping I'm not cutting you off. But second of all, I'm hoping you can read us another poem before we close the show, and then we'll maybe make some concluding things about.
Okay, so just a very, very 15-second poem.
Well, that'd be good, yeah. And we've got about 3 minutes left, so a 15-second one would do it. I think.
Well, I was just gonna.
If it's a little longer, go ahead. How about 14? How about 14 Weeks at Sea, which is on?
Yes, on page 37. That's what I was going to do. Here it is. 14 Weeks at Sea. Birth of my son. How Odysseus swims for days through troubled seas, cursed to be living, fated by the earth shaker to life, and fails to drown, fails to sink under into the land of fish and sea gods, those whales, the great gray whale who swallows the ocean and spits it up, swallows and splurges it all again and again, so that in this way the ocean continues to be, until he is finally tossed up on a beach, naked, without companions.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's nice. That's birth of my son, who is now 5. So.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to confess to you, I have a 25-year-old daughter.
Oh, man.
I'm a little older than you. But yes, I like that, and I like the way it sort of reinvents myth in that poem, and I think you do that several times in your poetry, that you sort of reconfigure the myth a little bit, or get us to look at things behind the myth. Anyway,
I certainly looked at the myths, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how much, they call it a myth, but it's probably just a good story too, right? The whole Odyssey. Sure. Well, we're coming to a conclusion. Thank you so much for this. I hope I hope it was fun for you. I hope it was fun for you. Folks, you've been listening to the PI New Poetry Show with your host, Carmelo Militano. And today, my guest was Darren Bifford with his book, False Spring. This just came out a few months ago, didn't it?
In the spring with Frick Books.
Oh, it did. It came out. You know what? I got myself mixed up. I thought, because I was reading about it. Yeah, that's right.
Spring books get forgotten. The spring books come out, and then summer, and no one's doing anything in the summer, and then in the fall. I'm going out east for some readings here next week to Halifax and Sackville and Fredericton, so you get more traction, such as it is.
Well, I hope so. I hope people buy it here in Winnipeg and across the country. Thanks again, Darren.
Thank you, Carmelo. Really appreciate all this.
Oh, you're welcome. Talk to you
on.
later. Bye.